My drone captured Bigfoot carrying human remains. At first, I thought it was a glitch, a shadow in the trees. But the camera didn't lie. A massive, towering figure moving through the Idaho backcountry, with what looked like a human body slung over its shoulder. The man behind the controller wasn't just some weekend hiker. He was a Navy veteran, trained to notice details others overlook. He knew this wasn't a bear, wasn't a trick of the light. But the moment the creature paused and turned toward the sound of the drone, everything changed. The forest went silent. His signal cut in and out. And what happened next has left him questioning whether he uncovered the truth or invited something far darker onto his trail. What did he really capture that day, and how far will it go to make sure no one else sees it? You found your way, here for a reason. In a world that can feel overwhelming, it's the gentle hearts that bring light. And yours is one of them. I never thought I'd find myself living in northern Idaho, but after 22 years in the Navy, the isolation was exactly what I needed. My name is Mark Ellison, and I moved here 8 months ago, trading the constant hum of aircraft carriers and bustling ports for the whisper of pine needles and mountain winds. The property I purchased sits at the edge of the Kaniksu National Forest, just remote enough that my nearest neighbor is 3 miles down an unpaved road. The cabin itself isn't much. 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, and a wraparound porch that's become my favorite spot to watch the sun set behind the ridgeline. It's simple, but after years of deployments in cramped quarters, it feels like a palace. Chose this location carefully. The surrounding wilderness offers the kind of solitude that helps quiet the memories of missions I'd rather forget. There's something therapeutic about being able to see for miles without spotting a single electric light. The forest here is old growth, mostly lodgepole pine and western red cedar, with understory so thick in places it looks impenetrable. My training as a naval reconnaissance specialist left me with habits I can't shake. Constantly scanning horizons, noting changes in the environment, maintaining detailed logs. I suppose that's why I took up drone flying. It gives me a sense of purpose while letting me explore the terrain from a safe distance. I invested in a professional-grade unit with high-resolution cameras and extended flight time, the kind of equipment that would have made our early surveillance missions a lot easier. The locals don't ask many questions, which suits me fine. When they do inquire about the drone, I tell them I'm documenting wildlife patterns or mapping the changing seasons. It's not entirely untrue. I've captured some stunning footage of elk herds moving through the valleys and eagles soaring above the tree line. But mostly, I fly because it helps me maintain that observer's distance I grew accustomed to during my service years. My daily routine is simple now. I wake before dawn, make coffee on the wood stove, and check the weather. If conditions are favourable, I'll pack my drone kit and hike to one of the elevated clearings I've scouted as launch sites. The morning light here has a quality I've never seen anywhere else. It filters through the mist in shafts of gold and amber, revealing layers of a landscape that remain hidden later in the day. There's a discipline to drone flying that appeals to my military background. Each flight requires careful planning, checking battery levels, monitoring wind conditions, maintaining line of sight, and always having a backup landing zone. I log every flight meticulously, noting timestamps, coordinates, and any significant observations. Old habits die hard, I suppose. The peace I've found here is different from what I expected. It's not the absence of sound. These mountains are alive with their own rhythm of bird calls, rustling leaves, and distant water moving over rocks. Instead, it's the absence of human chaos. No sirens, no radio chatter, no engines, no orders to follow. Just the quiet challenge of learning this landscape, one careful observation at a time. Drone. I tell them I'm documenting forest recovery patterns after the wildfires. It's true enough. I do spend considerable time mapping the burn zones, but mostly I fly because it gives structure to my days. I've developed a routine that feels almost military in its precision. Up before dawn, coffee on the porch while I check weather conditions and plan my flight paths. I maintain a detailed logbook, Old habits die hard, noting temperature, wind speed, and atmospheric pressure. By 0600 hours, I'm usually hiking to one of my established launch points with my drone kit, GPS unit, and enough supplies to last the day if needed. The morning flights are my favorite. There's something pristine about the wilderness at dawn, when the valleys are still filled with mist, and the only sound is the whir of my drone's rotors. I've mapped most of the accessible terrain within a 5-mile radius of my cabin, creating high-resolution images of the landscape's transformation. The burn scars from last season's fires create stark patterns against the healthy forest, nature's own reconnaissance photos. But it's the silence that first made me uneasy. I've spent enough time in wild places to know that forests are never truly quiet. There's always something. Wind in the canopy, birds calling, small animals moving through the understory. Yet there are moments here when everything just stops. No warning, no apparent cause. 1 minute the woods are alive with sound, the next it's like someone hit a mute button. The first time it happened, I was reviewing footage from my morning flight. I had my headphones on, listening to the ambient audio my drone captures, when the recording went dead silent for exactly 47 seconds. I checked the equipment, thinking it was a technical glitch. But then I noticed the timestamp, matched an entry in my field notes where I'd written, "Unusual quiet, check gear." It's happened 6 more times since then. Always when I'm alone, always complete silence, always lasting between 45 seconds and 2 minutes. I've started marking these episodes in my logbook with a simple Q for quiet, followed by the duration. Part of me wants to dismiss it as some atmospheric phenomenon I don't understand, or maybe wildlife responding to something my human senses can't detect. My training tells me to trust patterns, to document everything without jumping to conclusions, so I keep logging these moments of unnatural silence, trying to correlate them with weather conditions, time of day, moon phases, anything that might explain what I'm experiencing. The rational part of my mind says there must be a logical explanation, but there's another part, the part that spent thousands of hours reading environments for threat assessment, that won't let me simply brush this aside. Still, I maintain my routine. Each morning, I pack my gear, check my batteries, and launch my drone into the dawn light. I tell myself I'm just mapping the forest's recovery, documenting nature's resilience. But now I find myself paying closer attention to the sounds around me, noting not just what I hear, but what I don't. Happened again 3 days ago. I was reviewing footage from my afternoon flight over the eastern riverbank when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just another shadow pattern from the burn zones, but as I zoomed in, my pulse quickened. There, clearly visible in the muddy bank, was a series of depressions that made no sense. I've tracked plenty of wildlife in these parts. Elk leave distinctive prints, and even the largest grizzly leaves identifiable patterns. But these were different. The impressions were too large, too methodically placed. I spent 8 years analyzing reconnaissance footage in the Navy, and pattern recognition becomes second nature. These tracks showed clear heel strikes and toe progression, almost human-like, but scaled up to impossible proportions. I checked the GPS coordinates and pulled up my field notes from that day. The entry was brief. 14:37 hours. Survey of Burn Zone E7, River Segment Charlie. Note: peculiar odor near waypoint 3, possible carrion. I remembered that moment clearly now, though I hadn't connected it to anything significant at the time. The smell was distinctive, not the sweet rot of decomposition, but something more primal. A sour, musky scent that reminded me of wet fur mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. Using the drone's measurement tools, I calculated the size of the largest impression. 15.7 inches from heel to toe. The stride length between prints averaged 72 inches. I've seen grizzly tracks in soft mud that spread out to 14 inches, but these depressions had definition, structure, purpose. My training kicked in automatically. I started documenting everything systematically, saving multiple copies of the footage, recording precise timestamps and coordinates, noting weather conditions that could affect track preservation. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as some kind of natural phenomenon, maybe water erosion or livestock that had wandered off trail. But another part, the part that had kept me alive in combat zones, was sending up red flags. I found myself instinctively scanning the tree line more often during my flights now, watching for movement patterns that didn't match known wildlife behavior. The forest's random moments of silence took on new significance. In the military, we had a saying, once is chance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is a pattern. I wasn't at pattern status yet, but my internal radar was definitely pinging. That evening, I created a new section in my logbook specifically for anomalies. Anything that didn't fit the normal wilderness baseline I'd established over the past months. The tracks went in first, along with detailed sketches and measurements. Below that, I noted the location and characteristics of the strange odor. It felt good to approach this methodically, to impose some order on observations that threatened, to venture into uncomfortable territory. I didn't know what I was dealing with yet, but one thing was certain. I needed to stay alert. In the Navy, we learned that the most dangerous situations often announce themselves through subtle warnings. The trick was learning to read them before they evolved into something you couldn't handle. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the valley when I took the drone up for its final flight of the day. The weather station had reported clear conditions with light winds from the northwest, perfect for aerial surveillance. I'd modified my DJI Mavic with an enhanced microphone system, something I'd learned to appreciate during my Navy days when ambient sound often told you more than visuals alone. At 4:37 p.m., I was following the western drainage, keeping the drone at 300 feet to maintain a good view of the terrain while preserving battery life. The light was getting that golden quality that photographers call magic hour, making the burned sections of forest look almost beautiful in their devastation. That's when I heard it. Through my headphones came a series of deep, rhythmic knocks. At first, I thought it might be someone doing trail maintenance, but the pattern was too precise, too measured. 3 distinct knocks, followed by 2 shorter ones, then a pause. The sequence repeated. My hands tightened on the controller. In the Navy, we'd learned to recognize coded communications, everything from Morse code to more sophisticated patterns. These knocks had that same deliberate quality. They weren't random or natural, like a fallen branch or rock slide. They carried intent. I switched the drone to hover mode and focused on triangulating the sound. It was coming from a densely wooded section about half a mile east of my position. The knocks continued, maintaining their rhythm. 3 long, 2 short, pause. 3 long, 2 short, pause. The sound had a wooden quality, like something solid, striking a dead tree, but the force behind each impact suggested significant strength. I've heard woodpeckers in these forests before. This was different. Each knock resonated across the drainage with a depth that made the drone's microphone clip slightly. I checked my battery level, 18 minutes remaining, and began a careful grid search of the area. The knocking continued for another 47 seconds, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant. I kept the drone in position for 5 more minutes, but the forest remained quiet. During those minutes of silence, I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear anything through the headphones. My training kicked in, and I started cataloguing details. Time of day, GPS coordinates, duration of the knocking, precise rhythm pattern. I even used the drone's onboard thermometer to log the ambient temperature, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. When I finally brought the drone home, my hands were steady, but my mind was racing. I immediately backed up the audio file to 3 separate drives, a habit from my military days when losing data could cost lives. The knocking sequence played over and over in my head as I worked. 3 long, 2 short, pause. It was communication. I was certain of that. But with what? And why? I spent 2 hours that evening analysing the audio, cleaning it up and running it through various filters. The pattern remained consistent throughout the recording. Whatever made those sounds had maintained perfect rhythm, suggesting not just intelligence but purpose. I thought about sharing the recording with local forestry services, but held back. My years in the Navy had taught me the value of collecting solid intelligence before making reports. One audio file, however strange, wasn't enough. I needed more data, more patterns, more proof. That night, I added a new entry to my anomaly log. October 12th, 16:37 hours. Rhythmic knocking sequence recorded in Western Drainage. Pattern: 3 long, 2 short, consistent, spacing. Duration: 47 seconds. Sound carries characteristics of deliberate signaling. I closed my laptop, but couldn't shake the feeling that I'd documented something more significant than just strange forest sounds. In the Navy, we had a saying, trust your gut, but verify your intel. My gut was telling me these knocks were important. Now I needed to verify why. The weeks following that strange knocking incident left me restless. I kept reviewing the audio, trying to convince myself it was just woodpeckers or falling timber. But my years of signal analysis in the Navy wouldn't let me accept such simple explanations. The rhythm was too deliberate, too structured. It was early October when everything changed. The morning air had that crisp bite that signals the approaching winter in northern Idaho. I'd been mapping the burn zones from last summer's wildfires, charred stretches where the forest floor was finally visible from above. The drone's battery showed 75% as I guided it over a particularly wide clearing at about 200 feet altitude. The camera feed was steady, documenting the usual pattern of blackened trees and ash-covered ground when movement caught my eye. At first I thought it was a bear, but the proportions were wrong, way wrong. I adjusted the drone's hover position and zoomed in. My hands started trembling on the controls. Through the screen, I watched a massive figure moving with purposeful strides across the burned-out space. It was upright, distinctly bipedal, but the height had to be at least 8 feet. The image wasn't crystal clear. Smoke from still smouldering ground fires created a hazy filter, and the subject was partially obscured by standing dead trees. But what made my blood run cold was what it was carrying. Draped over one shoulder was something pale and limp, something with proportions that looked disturbingly human. The way it hung there, the way the limbs swayed with each step, my mind refused to process it fully, but my training kicked in. I steadied my hands and tried to maintain a stable tracking shot. The figure moved with a fluid grace that defied everything I knew about known wildlife. Bears lumber, mountain lions prowl. But this had a deliberate gait that spoke of intelligence, of purpose. My years of observing human movement patterns screamed that this was something else entirely. I watched until the figure disappeared into the tree line on the far side of the clearing. The drone's battery warning chirped, snapping me out of my stunned state. I guided it home on autopilot, my mind racing. Back in my cabin, I immediately downloaded the footage. For hours, I sat there replaying those 47 seconds, frame by frame, adjusting contrast, sharpening edges, trying to find some rational explanation, but each viewing only reinforced what I'd seen. The height comparison to the surrounding trees, the smooth bipedal motion, that terrible, limp burden it carried. I've reviewed surveillance footage of every large predator in North America. I know how they move, how they carry prey. This wasn't that. This was something that walked like a person, but wasn't a person. Something that knew exactly where it was going and what it was doing. The implications of what that pale, dangling form might be made me sick to my stomach. I found myself checking the locks on my doors that night, though I knew they'd mean nothing if something that size wanted to get in. Sleep was impossible. Every crack of a branch outside sent my heart racing. The footage haunted me through a sleepless night. By dawn, I knew I had to investigate the clearing myself. My training wouldn't let me do otherwise. Digital evidence needs ground confirmation. I packed my day bag with the essentials, GPS unit, high-resolution camera, water, and my K-bar. Knife. The familiar weight of the tactical gear provided little comfort this time. The drive to the trailhead took 45 minutes. Early morning fog clung to the valleys, and the temperature hovered around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. I kept replaying the drone footage in my mind, trying to rationalize what I'd seen, but the image of that limp form wouldn't leave me. The hike to the burn zone was steeper than it had looked from above. My boots crunched through frost-covered ash, leaving clear prints in the disturbed soil. The silence was absolute. No birds, no squirrels, not even insects. In the Navy, we called this kind of quiet predator silence. Every living thing knows when an apex hunter is near. As I approached the clearing where I'd captured the footage, the hair on my neck stood up. Something felt wrong. The air had a thickness to it, like the pressure before a storm, but the sky was clear. That sour smell I'd noticed weeks ago hung, faintly in the air, stronger near certain areas of disturbed ground. The signs were everywhere once I started looking. Branches snapped off at heights well above what a bear could reach, 8, maybe 9 feet up. These weren't random breaks, either. They showed clear twisting patterns, like they'd been deliberately wrenched aside to clear a path. My mind struggled to process the implications. I found what looked like a game trail, but the spacing of the tracks was all wrong. The depressions were too far apart for any known wildlife, and the way the soil was compressed spoke of immense weight. Following the trail, I discovered more broken branches and disturbed vegetation, all consistent with something very large moving through. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Every combat instinct I'd developed over years of deployment screamed at me to get out. My eyes darted between the trees, searching for movement, but the burned forest played tricks with depth and shadow. The standing dead trees created a maze of grey pillars that could hide anything. I knelt to photograph one of the clearer tracks, trying to maintain my composure. The depression was huge, easily 16 inches long, and showed clear toe impressions. This was no bear print. Bears don't have an arch like that, and they certainly don't walk heel to toe like a human. A branch cracked somewhere behind me, too loud to be small wildlife. I froze, my heart pounding against my ribs. Years of training told me not to run. Running triggers pursuit instincts in predators. Instead, I slowly stood, keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening. The feeling of being observed intensified, like crosshairs on my back. I couldn't let this go. After reviewing my initial ground investigation, I knew I needed better equipment to document whatever was out there. I invested in 2 high-powered zoom lenses for the drone's camera system and purchased 4 extended life batteries. The new gear set me back nearly $2,000, but I needed absolute clarity if I was going to prove what I'd seen. 3 days later, I returned to the burn zone. The morning was crisp, with excellent visibility. Perfect conditions for aerial reconnaissance. I set up my ground station on a rocky outcrop that gave me clear line of sight in all directions. The new batteries would give me 90 minutes of flight time each. The first hour went smoothly. I methodically mapped the area where I'd captured the original footage, flying in a grid pattern like we used to do in the service. But as I pushed deeper into the valley, the video feed began to deteriorate. At first, it was just static, brief interruptions that could have been explained by wind or terrain interference. Then the distortions became more frequent, more purposeful somehow. I checked my equipment thoroughly. All connections were secure, battery levels optimal, no obvious technical issues. Yet the interference continued to worsen. The video would cut out completely for several seconds, then return showing the drone in a completely different position than where I'd directed it. During my 4th flight of the day, something changed. I was tracking along a ridgeline about 800 feet up when the drone's stabilization system suddenly failed. The aircraft began to spiral, not like a mechanical failure I'd ever seen, but in tight, controlled circles. I fought with the controls, trying to regain command, but it was useless. The drone plummeted into the forest below. The GPS coordinates gave me a rough location for the crash site. It took me 45 minutes of careful hiking to reach it. What I found made my blood run cold. The drone lay in a small clearing, its frame mostly intact, but the damage it bore wasn't from the impact. Deep gouges ran across the carbon fiber casing, parallel marks that looked deliberately carved. They reminded me of stone tool marks I'd seen in archaeology documentaries, but these were fresh, made by something with enough strength to score, hardened composite material. I photographed everything, my hands shaking slightly as I documented the damage. The marks were evenly spaced, too regular to be random. Whatever had made them had done so with purpose, perhaps even intelligence. The drone's memory card was still intact, and I secured it carefully in my vest pocket. The silence of the forest pressed in around me as I packed up the damaged drone. That familiar sour smell hung heavy in the air, stronger than I'd ever encountered it before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, studied even, by something that understood exactly what my equipment was for, and had decided to send me a message. I made it back to my truck without incident, but the implications of what I'd found weighed heavily on my mind. This wasn't random animal behavior. Something out there had deliberately disabled my drone and marked it, showing both tool use and intent. The question was, what would it do next? The hike back to retrieve the downed drone felt different. Wrong. My years of military training had taught me to trust my instincts, and every nerve ending was firing warning signals. The forest, usually alive with bird calls and small animal movements, had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring, searching for any input. I kept my pace steady, maintaining situational awareness while following the drone's last known GPS coordinates. About half a mile in, I heard it. Heavy movement in the tree line to my left, maybe 40 yards out. The footfalls were too deliberate to be deer, too heavy for a bear. Whatever it was, matched my speed exactly, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. My hand instinctively went to my hip where my sidearm would have been during deployments, but I wasn't in the service anymore, and I was armed with nothing more than a survival knife and my satellite phone. The phone showed no signal, not unusual for these remote valleys, but unsettling given the circumstances. The parallel movement continued for another quarter mile. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal curious about my presence, but the precision of its pacing suggested intelligence. It stayed just inside the tree line, obscured by the dense forest, but close, enough to make its presence known. A bead of sweat rolled down my back despite the cool air. I maintained my heading, but began taking mental notes of possible escape routes, high ground positions, anything I could use to my tactical advantage if needed. The terrain here was steep and unforgiving, with loose, scree slopes leading up to rocky outcrops. Suddenly, rocks began tumbling down one of these slopes about 200 yards ahead. Not the natural scatter of erosion. These rocks were being dislodged by something moving across the face of the slope. Something big enough to send bowling ball-sized boulders crashing down through the trees. I froze, my training warring with my rising panic. The movement in the tree line had stopped too, creating a triangle between my position, the parallel tracker, and whatever was on the slope. I was being hemmed in, herded like prey. The realization hit me with cold clarity. This was coordinated behavior. More rocks clattered down, closer now. The sound echoed off the valley walls, making it impossible to pinpoint the exact location. But I could feel the pressure building, the noose tightening. Whatever had been shadowing me was no longer trying to hide its presence. I heard branches snap behind me, not from my original tracker's position, but from a new direction. The sound was deliberate, almost like a signal. My pulse pounded in my ears as I processed what this meant. There were more than two. They were coordinating, and they wanted me to know it. The forest silence deepened even further, if that was possible. No wind, no birds, not even the sound of insects. Just the occasional rockfall and the heavy, measured footsteps that continued to mirror my movements. I was being hunted by something that understood strategy, something that knew these mountains far better than I did. After that unsettling experience in the forest, I knew I needed to bring this to someone's attention. The next morning, I drove the 40 minutes into town to speak with the county sheriff. My laptop contained all the drone footage I'd collected, including the disturbing blur of that massive figure and the audio recordings of those rhythmic knocks. Sheriff Thompson's office was a modest space with wood-panelled walls covered in local maps and wildlife advisories. He was a weathered man in his mid-50s who'd probably seen everything these mountains could throw at someone, or so he thought. I could tell from his expression that he was already categorizing me as another city transplant, spooked by wilderness. Shadows. Mr. Ellison, he said, leaning back in his chair after viewing the footage, I appreciate you bringing this to our attention. But what you're showing me here could be any number of things. That blur could easily be a bear standing up. They do that, you know. And those knocks? Woodpeckers can echo pretty far in these valleys. I kept my voice steady, professional. Sheriff, I spent 12 years in the Navy doing reconnaissance work. I know how to identify and analyze unusual patterns. The gait of whatever I captured on film, it wasn't ursine. The stride length alone suggests something much larger. Thompson sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, we get reports like this every season. People move up here from the cities. They're not used to how active our wildlife is. Bears, elk, even moose can leave some pretty impressive tracks, and in low light, with shadows playing tricks. What about the tool marks on my drone? I interrupted, pulling out my damaged equipment. Or the coordinated movement patterns I encountered. The sheriff examined the drone briefly, almost dismissively. Could be bear claws. They're curious creatures, especially with unfamiliar objects. As for feeling followed, well, predators will sometimes track humans out of curiosity. It's natural behavior. I could see the conversation was going nowhere. Thompson was already reaching for some wildlife safety pamphlets on his desk, his way of wrapping things up. But something in his manner seemed off, too practiced. Like he'd had this conversation before, and had his responses ready. Just be careful up there, he added, his tone shifting slightly. Stay aware of your surroundings, keep your distance from any large wildlife, and maybe stick to flying that drone during daylight hours only. There was something in the way he emphasized that last part, a hint of genuine concern beneath the official skepticism. As I gathered my equipment, Thompson cleared his throat. And, Mr. Ellison, if you do see anything else, unusual, you can always report it. But maybe keep the footage between us for now. No need to stir up local speculation. I left the sheriff's office more frustrated than when I'd arrived, but that last comment stuck with me. It wasn't quite a warning, but it wasn't quite dismissal either. Thompson had been too quick to explain everything away, too ready with his pamphlets and standard responses. It felt like he was following a script, one designed to close cases rather than investigate them. As I was leaving the sheriff's office, a Forest Service ranger caught my eye from across the parking lot. He was leaning against his green government truck, and something in his posture told me he'd been waiting. I recognized the uniform but hadn't met him before. Mr. Ellison, he called out. Got a minute? Name's Dave Connor. I walked over, noting his deliberate casual manner. Ranger Connor was probably in his early 40s, with the lean build of someone who spent more time on trails than behind a desk. Heard. You were showing some interesting drone footage to Thompson, he said, keeping his voice low despite the empty lot. I'm curious about what you captured up there. I studied him for a moment, weighing my options. After the sheriff's dismissal, I was hesitant to share more, but something in Connor's tone seemed genuine. I've got the laptop in my truck, I offered. Though I'm guessing you'll tell me it's just bears too. He smiled tightly. Let's take a look anyway. We sat in my vehicle, and I played through the footage again. Unlike the sheriff, Connor watched with intense focus, especially during the sequence with the bipedal figure. He asked me to replay the audio of the knocking several times. Location, he asked finally. Upper Morrison drainage, about 3 miles past the old burn. Connor nodded slowly. That area's had some interesting reports over the years. Nothing official, mind you. Nothing we could verify. But he glanced around before continuing. Look, I've been ranging these forests for 16 years. Most stories, most sightings, they're exactly what Thompson says. People seeing shadows, misidentifying normal wildlife. But sometimes, he trailed off, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes we get reports that don't fit the usual pattern. Experienced hunters who won't go back to certain drainages. Hikers finding structures that shouldn't exist that far out. And occasionally, people who just don't come back. I felt a chill despite the warm truck cab. Missing persons? Official. Reports cite exposure, accidents, animal attacks, the usual wilderness hazards. But some of us have wondered. He paused. That figure in your footage, the way it moves. I've seen bear, elk, moose. That wasn't any of those. So you believe me? What I believe doesn't matter. What matters is this. Don't go back up there alone. Whatever you think you're tracking, it's tracking you too. He opened the truck door. Officially, this conversation never happened. I've got a family, a pension to think about. Can't be the ranger who started a Bigfoot panic. I understand, I said. One more thing, he added, stepping down. If you do go back, watch your drones. Battery levels. Some of these areas, they get weird electromagnetic disturbances. Equipment fails, compasses go wrong. Natural phenomena, probably. But worth keeping in mind. I watched him walk back to his truck, my mind racing with the implications of his warnings. He'd confirmed my suspicions while officially denying everything. And somehow that was more unsettling than any direct confirmation would have been. The next morning, I was scrolling through the local news feed when my coffee nearly slipped from my hand. A bulletin from the county sheriff's department detailed a missing backpacker, last seen in the Morrison drainage area, the exact location where I'd captured my disturbing footage. Sarah Chen, 28 years old, had set out for a 3-day solo trek 8 days ago. Her car was found at the trailhead, properly parked with a valid wilderness permit on the dashboard. The article included a photo of her smiling face and a detailed description of her gear: a blue mountain hardware tent, an orange Osprey backpack, and distinctive red La Sportiva hiking boots. My hands trembled as I opened my laptop and pulled up the drone footage again. The figure I'd captured had been hauling something I'd tried to convince myself wasn't what my gut told me it was. Now, staring at Sarah's photo, the weight of what I might have witnessed pressed down on me like a physical force. Forced myself to watch frame by frame, analysing the blurry shape being dragged across that burned clearing. The orange blur trailing behind the massive figure. Could it have been her backpack? The timestamp on my footage was from 4 days ago, well within the timeline of her disappearance. The bulletin mentioned search and rescue teams had covered most of the marked trails, but found no sign of Chen. They were now expanding their search radius, focusing on off-trail areas where a hiker might have become disoriented. But I knew they were looking in the wrong places, following standard SAR protocols that assumed normal wilderness mishaps. I picked up my phone 3 times to call, the sheriff's office putting it down each time. What could I say? That I had drone footage of something inhuman carrying what might be human remains. After the sheriff's dismissive response to my earlier visit, I knew how that would sound. Even Ranger Connor's cautious warnings hadn't officially acknowledged anything beyond normal wilderness hazards. But Sarah Chen was real. She had a family waiting for news, friends who'd posted worried messages on social media. Her disappearance transformed my unsettling footage from an abstract mystery into something far more horrific. Whatever I'd captured on camera wasn't just an unknown creature. It was potentially a predator, one that might have taken a human life. I pulled up the terrain map on my computer, marking the exact coordinates where I'd captured the footage. The location was well off any established trail, in a steep section of the drainage that SAR teams might not prioritize. My stomach churned as I realized I might be the only person who knew where to look, and the only one who understood what they might be dealing with. The weight of this knowledge felt unbearable. Every minute I hesitated with this information could matter. But revealing what I knew might also expose something that, as Ranger Connor had hinted, some people wanted to keep hidden. The question now wasn't just about my credibility or safety. It was about my responsibility to Sarah Chen and anyone else who might venture into those woods unaware of what lurked there. The morning sun was barely cresting the ridgeline when I prepped my drone for what I knew would be my final reconnaissance flight. My hands moved mechanically through the pre-flight checks: battery levels, camera settings, GPS signal strength. The familiar routine helped steady my nerves, but couldn't completely quiet the voice in my head warning me that I was taking an enormous risk. I'd chosen my launch site carefully, a small clearing that offered clear line of sight to the drainage where I'd captured the previous footage. The air was crisp and still, perfect flying conditions. Too perfect, really. The forest held that unnatural silence I'd come to recognize, the kind that made the hair on my neck stand up. At 7:15 a.m., I sent the drone up, keeping it high initially to survey the broader area. The morning light cast long shadows through the trees, making it difficult to distinguish natural shapes from potential movement. I kept the flight path steady, methodically scanning the terrain where Sarah Chen might have vanished. 20 minutes into the flight, movement caught my eye on the monitor. Something massive shifted between two ancient cedars just at the edge of my camera's range. I adjusted the drone's heading, heart pounding as I tried to get a better angle. The figure was dark, easily 8 feet tall, moving with that same unsettling fluidity I'd seen before. This wasn't a bear rearing up. The proportions were all wrong, and the movement too deliberate. I had just started to zoom in when the video feed stuttered. Static crackled across the screen, and the transmission indicators flashed red. My hands flew across the controls trying to stabilize the connection, but the interference grew worse. Through breaks in the static, I caught glimpses of the figure turning toward my drone, as if it knew exactly where to look. The feed cut completely. The drone's return to home function kicked in, and I watched the GPS indicator as it made its way back. But my attention was suddenly drawn from the screen by a sensation I'd learned to trust during my Navy days: the weight of unseen eyes. Looking up from my control panel, I scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but the silence had deepened, becoming almost physical in its intensity. The sun was now well above the ridgeline, but shadows seemed to be growing longer instead of shorter. My tactical training screamed at me that I'd stayed too long, allowed myself to become too focused on the screen. I kept my movements deliberate as I packed up my gear, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder. The drone touched down, and I quickly stowed it in its case. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches above me seemed amplified. My heart rate had kicked up, and I could feel adrenaline starting to flood my system. The clearing no longer felt like a strategic position. It felt exposed, vulnerable. Shouldered my pack and began walking back to my truck, maintaining what I hoped was a confident, steady pace. But I couldn't shake the certainty that something was pacing me just beyond the tree line, matching my speed with footfalls too quiet for anything of its size. The forest remained deathly still around me, as if every living creature was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The late afternoon had stretched into evening while I reviewed the footage, and darkness was settling in fast. My hands shook slightly as I packed my gear into the truck, the events of the morning still churning in my mind. The forest around my property had transformed into a maze of deep shadows, and the security lights from my cabin seemed to barely penetrate the gloom. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that years of military training were making me jump at shadows. But then I heard it. A crack of branches from the tree line, maybe 50 yards out. Not the sound of wind or a falling limb, but the distinctive snap of something large moving through the undergrowth. My throat went dry. I forced myself to continue loading equipment methodically, maintaining my routine. The muscle memory from my Navy days kicked in. Stay calm, assess the situation, identify exits. But my hands were trembling as I secured the drone case in the truck bed. That's when I heard the whistle of something cutting through the air. A rock, roughly the size of my fist, slammed into the ground less than 3 feet from where I stood. It wasn't a random fall or a coincidence. The trajectory was deliberate, the force behind it massive. The rock bounced once and rolled to a stop near my boot. My entire body went cold. This wasn't just observation anymore. This was a message. The rock had to have been thrown from the tree line, but the distance was impossible for any normal animal. I'd seen military-grade projectile tests that couldn't match this force. My mind raced through everything I documented. The tracks, the knocks, the footage, the missing hiker. And suddenly, it all crystallized into a terrifying reality. Whatever was out there wasn't just watching anymore. It was sending a warning. Another branch snapped, closer this time. The sound came from a different direction than the rock, and my combat instinct screamed that I was being flanked. The security lights seemed to dim, as if the darkness itself was pressing in around me. I could smell that sour, musky odor again, stronger than ever. My hands fumbled with the truck keys as I heard heavy footfalls, actual footfalls, moving through the underbrush. The steps were methodical, deliberate, nothing like a bear or elk. They were coming from multiple directions now, and the realization hit me like ice water. There was more than one of them. I managed to get the key in the door, my training warring with primal fear. Every instinct told me to run, but I forced myself to move with purpose. Running triggers pursuit. That's true for any predator. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and flipped on the high beams. The powerful LEDs cut through the darkness, illuminating the first row of trees. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something massive moving back into the shadows. The shape was upright, easily 8 feet tall, but the details were lost, in the darkness. What struck me most was how smoothly it moved, like a soldier taking cover. Deliberate, tactical, intelligent. I spent the next few days methodically securing everything I'd documented. The drone footage, including the disturbing images from the clearing, went onto encrypted hard drives. I made 3 copies. One for a safety deposit box at First Idaho Bank in town, one hidden in my cabin's crawl space, and one mailed to myself at a P.O. box 2 counties over. Military habits die hard. Redundancy keeps secrets safe. Sleep became my enemy. Every night, my mind replayed that footage of the massive figure in the clearing, hauling what I couldn't deny looked like human remains. The image was burned into my consciousness. The fluid, purposeful movement, the impossible height, the way it navigated the burned timber with familiar ease. In my dreams, the figure would turn toward the drone, its features always lost in shadow, but its presence overwhelming with intelligence and intent. I'd wake in cold sweats, checking my windows and doors. The security system I'd installed felt inadequate now. How do you defend against something that can throw rocks with that kind of force, that moves with tactical precision, that seems to understand technology enough to deliberately disable drones? The question of what to do with the evidence gnawed at me constantly. I had proof of something extraordinary. Multiple video clips, audio recordings of those rhythmic knocks, thermal signatures that defied explanation. As a Navy veteran, my testimony carried weight. I could take it public, release it online, send it to researchers or news outlets. But then I'd remember the sheriff's dismissive attitude, the Forest Service ranger's careful warnings. I'd think about other Bigfoot witnesses I'd read about online. Credible people whose lives were destroyed by ridicule, whose careers imploded after coming forward. And worse, I'd remember that deliberate rock throw, that feeling of being watched and stalked. Whatever was out there had made it clear they didn't want to be exposed. I stopped flying the drones altogether. The risk wasn't worth it anymore. My last spare sat untouched in its case, and I sold the others for parts, claiming crash damage. Local buyers didn't ask questions. I told myself it was temporary, just until things cooled down. But deep down, I knew I was retreating. The nights were the hardest. I'd sit in my cabin, listening to the forest sounds, trying to distinguish natural animal movements from something else. Sometimes the woods would go completely silent, that unnatural quiet that had first raised my suspicions. During those moments, I'd feel the weight of what I knew pressing down on me like a physical force. I started sleeping with my service pistol nearby, though I doubted it would make much difference if they decided to come closer. The rock throw had made their capabilities clear. They could have hit me directly if they'd wanted to. It was a warning, a demonstration of power and restraint that spoke to an intelligence that terrified me more than any display of pure aggression would have. The missing hiker's case remained open. I saw the posters at the general store, watched search and rescue teams deploy and return empty-handed. Each time I passed that bulletin board, my stomach would knot up. I knew something, had evidence. That might help explain what happened, but I couldn't bring myself to come forward. The burden of that knowledge felt like a stone in my gut. Some nights, I'd pull out one of the hard drives and review the footage, making sure I hadn't imagined it all. But the evidence was always there. The massive figure moving with undeniable purpose, the tracks that no known animal could have made, the systematic interference with my equipment. I had proof of something that would reshape our understanding of what lives in these mountains. And yet, here I sat, in my fortified cabin, keeping it all locked away. I've spent months wrestling with what to do with this evidence. The hard drives sit like unexploded ordnance in their hiding places, each containing footage that could upend everything we think we know about what lives in these mountains. Or maybe, and this thought haunts me just as much, what I captured was something far more mundane, but equally sinister. Human predators using the Bigfoot myth as cover for their crimes. The missing hiker's case eventually went cold. Search teams exhausted every conventional possibility. I still see the family sometimes when they come up to put fresh flowers at the trailhead. Each time, the weight of my silence feels heavier. But what could I tell them? That I have drone footage of something massive carrying what looked like human remains through a burned-out clearing. That whatever it was showed signs of intelligence and technological awareness far beyond any known animal. To those who venture into these remote places, especially with drones and cameras, hoping to unlock these mysteries, proceed with extreme caution. What I experienced went far beyond simple wilderness encounters. There was purpose in those actions. The strategic disabling of my equipment, the warning shots, the calculated displays of presence. Whether it was an unknown species protecting its territory or something else entirely, the message was clear. Some secrets demand to remain hidden. I still live here in northern Idaho, but I've changed my habits. No more solo hikes into the deep, backcountry. No more drone flights over certain drainages. The forest demands respect, not just for its natural dangers, but for what it might conceal. There are places where the silence falls too completely, where the shadows move with too much intention, where ancient eyes may still watch from the tree line. The evidence I gathered sits secured away, a dead man's switch of sorts. Perhaps someday it will help piece together a larger truth, or perhaps it will only deepen the mystery that has surrounded these mountains for generations. What I know for certain is that my time in the Navy taught me to trust my training, trust my observations, and know when I'm outmatched. To this day, I can't definitively say what I documented during those months of drone flights, but I can say this. There are things in these woods that defy easy explanation. Whether you choose to believe my account or not, remember, when the forest goes quiet, when you feel watched, when something moves with purpose just beyond your sight, respect it. Turn back. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Thank you for being part of this moment. I'll be here tomorrow, ready to share another story that comforts the soul.